All right, welcome to this evening's conversation with the Phillips Collection and artist Julia Chon. Happy belated New Year to everyone here. My name is Andrea Kim Neighbors, and I'm the Manager of Education Initiatives at the Smithsonian Asian Pacific American Center. This is a very special evening for me as I used to work for the Phillips Collection. I love Julia's work, so I'm thrilled to be talking with her. And I also love the artists that Julia has included in her reimagined logo. When I first saw Julia's logo, which includes likenesses of Isamu Noguchi, Nikki S. Alfonso Ossorio, Ching Ho Cheng, and Jennifer Wen Ma, it made me reflect on my own introduction to the Phillips Collection, wanting to know more about Asian American artists who might be in the collection and in the galleries. Yasuo Kuniyoshi's main family became an instant favorite. I fell in love with that painting and dove into as much literature as possible to learn about Kuniyoshi's life and Kuniyoshi's work. Seeing Nikki Lee's photographs became powerful meditations about belonging, visibility, and identity. Alfonso Ossorio's works activated my imagination. Just looking at his work simply woke me up, and I was taken away by his work. As a mixed race Asian American woman myself, I loved and still love learning about these Asian American artists who I didn't know much about before coming to the Phillips Collection. I'm hopeful that for young Asian American students and artists today can grow up recalling the names Noguchi, Ossorio, Lee, Ma, Chang, and so many more as great American artists that they see themselves in and their stories in. It also makes me hopeful that students and people of all backgrounds see Asian American artists as history makers, cultural influencers, and as Julia said in her description about her logo, trailblazers in the art world. The Phillips Collection is celebrating its 100 years through a variety of great programs and celebrations, including this wonderful series called Our Logo Reimagined. This series has been creatively led by 12 local artists in Washington, D.C., where each artist reimagined the Phillips Centennial logo in their own style. Tonight, we'll be learning more about Julia and get to see images of her own work. I'll then ask Julia some questions about her and her process, and finally we'll open things up so you can ask questions yourself. And the chat will be open for those questions as well. So finally, I'm thrilled to be in conversation with Julia Chon, also known by her artist name Kimchi Juice. Julia is a Washington, D.C. based artist and muralist. Through portraiture highlighting Asian women, her work explores the relationship between cultural tradition and its effects on generational identity and the decisions we make to form our own identities as one Asian Americans. With a prominent Korean aesthetic in each piece, Chon merges her ancestry and traditions with the contemporary to convey the nuances of the Korean diaspora. As Chon's work makes its way from canvases to large-scale murals, those intimate portraits take center stage in an urban environment. Her murals can be found internationally, and her work has been exhibited in solo and group shows in Washington, D.C., Los Angeles, California, and Miami, Florida. Her clients and collaborations include NASA, Apple, the Korean Cultural Center, and HBO, among many others. And you can follow her on Instagram at Kimchi Juice. Now, I'm happy to hand things over to Julia.
Yeah, thank you so much, Andrea. Could I get the slides, please? Okay, perfect. Yeah, hi, everyone. Thank you, Andrea, for the introduction. It was an honor to be selected to redesign the logo for the Phillips 100 project and to be speaking with the Phillips Collection tonight. As you heard, my name is Julia Chon. I'm also known by the artist name Kimchi Juice, and I'm a 21-year-old artist and muralist based in DC. I remember visiting the Phillips Collection for the first time when I was 14 and it leaving such a strong impression on me as a then aspiring artist. It really is a dream come true to be collaborating with the collection 7 years later. On the screen is one of my murals I painted in 2019 in Austin, Texas. It's titled Sanja. This mural is very dear to me. It was one of the first murals I painted of a Korean woman, and it was painted in 2 days in the freezing cold. So it has a very strong memory. Could I get the next slide? Thank you. My work explores the relationship between cultural tradition and its effects on generational identity. As a biracial Korean that grew up in a multi-generational household with my mom, brothers, and grandparents, I didn't really fit the mold for what is typically viewed as being Asian American. I was very proud to be Korean, and that pride was instilled in me by my grandparents and family, but it was also made clear to me at a young age that I was kind of an outsider within my own race. Growing up, I felt that I would never be completely accepted by either community, white or Korean, that I belonged to, and so I would have to make my own way in forming my identity. And here is a portrait of my grandparents, my grandmother on the left and grandfather on the right. And the portrait of my grandmother was painted in 2019 and my grandfather was painted in 2020. Could I get the next slide? So about 5 years ago, in this pursuit of trying to figure out what it meant to be Asian American, what it meant to be Korean American, I started painting portraits of contemporary Korean women wearing the traditional hanbok dress. And these two were one of my first paintings of Korean women, both painted in early 2019. Next slide. In painting these portraits, I realized that there were very few depictions of Asian people, and especially Asian women, in popular media and art that were coming from the viewpoint and voice of an Asian woman. Too often, mainly male artists flatten Asian women to generalize portrayals of being exotic or submissive. With this in mind, I simplified my style using minimal lines and shapes to try and convey complex emotions to a subject matter that is too often flattened. And here is a mural that I painted in August that's currently on view at Culture House in DC. Next slide. Recently, my work has been exploring the evolution of the Korean family. During the pandemic, I started a photo archive project called the Korean Archives. Initially a way to preserve the many stories and photos my grandmother kept of her and my grandfather's family dating back to the early 1900s in Seoul, it has evolved into a submission-based community archive that works to preserve the images and stories of our ancestors. The project has been rewarding in so many ways, but in particular, it made me realize how deep the collective bond we share as Koreans, as diasporic Asians runs, regardless of the differences in location, upbringing, and path we and our families have chosen. And the two photos on the right are of my grandfather's family, taken around the 60s. And then on the left is a painting I painted a few months ago that was inspired by those photos. It's my grandfather's parents and siblings. Next slide. Ultimately, Asian Americans and Asian American artists have been erased from US history. To commemorate the centennial anniversary of the Phillips Collection, I painted the portraits of 5 Asian and Asian American artists whose work resides in the museum. Isamu Noguchi, Jennifer Wen Ma, Ching Ho Cheng, Nikki S, and Alfonso Ossorio, all pictured in this painting, were and continue to be trailblazers in the art world, and their works have left an indelible print on history and the story of Asia America. Reflecting on the past century of the Phillips Collection, I began to envision what the next 100 years would look like for this esteemed museum. With the power to shape history, I hope that the future of the collection is one of diversity, inclusion, and equality. It was an honor to be selected to redesign the logo for the Phillips Collection, and I look forward to seeing what the coming century brings. Thank you.
Julia, thank you so much for sharing these beautiful images of your work. I've had the great privilege of seeing your murals throughout DC and seeing these paintings and seeing photographs of your family and hearing more about your connections and your thought process in creating them makes them all the more powerful. In staying with this image, I have a few questions I wanted to ask you to learn more about you and your work. And I think a lot of the powerful symbolism and themes that come out of your work. For the first question is, I'd love to learn more about your process with this particular logo. I think it's so powerful. I love the strength in it. And I love just seeing all of these superstars together. As you were spending time with these artists and spending time with their life stories, I'm curious what was resonating with you as you were working on this logo?
Yeah, I mean, I think that when I was brainstorming for this logo and when I approached it for the first time, I really wanted to highlight the artists in the collection that sort of represented who I feel that I am, who were strong Asians, Asian Americans. And I think that growing up and going to museums and getting inspired by art, I realized that there wasn't a lot of representation of contemporary Asian artists. And I think that whenever I would go to a museum and I'd go to the Asian art section of the museum, it was like China, Japan, and Korea were the three countries that were highlighted, and it was all work from like the 18th century, or most of it anyways. And it was like widespread throughout the museums that I visited on the East Coast. And I think that from a young age, I didn't see that as like being who I was or seeing the work that my friends were creating. And so I thought it was really important to highlight these stories and to have these 5 artists that are in the Phillips Collection that are really cool and who aren't necessarily talked about that much. I mean, Noguchi has a museum in New York, and he was like really like impressive when I was reading about him, and like also had like he was in a Japanese internment camp, and it was like it's like a huge like piece of American history that isn't necessarily acknowledged. And Ossorio in particular was a huge he was a brilliant artist, but also art collector and curator who was friends with Jackson Pollock and all these other artists from that era. Um, but when you hear Pollock, you don't hear Ossorio's name. And so I really wanted to take this opportunity to just kind of like show that these are like superheroes.
I love in kind of saying on the word superheroes. I love the way you have like even the posture. I love Noguchi kind of with the, you know, like that business like headshot pose of the art press. I loved it. I also love that, you know, Noguchi is very special for me. Something you mentioned in your talk about, you know, the mixed race experience of never being fully accepted from your Korean and white side. I share that experience with you. There's always this kind of uncomfortable negotiation of being in between. And you know, it's different for every individual. But I think there's so many powerful commonalities too. In with Noguchi, you know, he talks about that, his own experience of going to Japan with his mother, who was a white woman, and then always he said something powerful about feeling like he was always an appendage to her being or to her father, and you know, following his life and seeing an amazing mixed race Asian American artist. And but also with these other artists, like knowing their connections, like learning more about Osorio. I had to learn more about Osorio after I saw your logo, because like I remember, you know, some things about him, but I wanted to go back, and he was among so many greats. You know, as you said, we can name Pollock. Pollock is such an identifiable name and artist, but you're right, we don't, Osorio is not often right there with him. But moving on, I think kind of on the same vein, I think for you as an artist, you already touched on a lot of the stories that are so important about what we know, what we revere about these artists. But for you, what are the stories that live with you as you create your work?
I think that the stories that live with me are the stories of my ancestors ultimately. I think that I don't think my family and my heritage and the culture I was raised in has been such a huge influence on my work today, especially my relationship with my grandparents, who I've been very fortunate to live with for the majority of my life. And it was their influence and their knowledge about kind of like this motherland that seemed so far away to me that left such a huge impression on me growing up. And so whenever I approach painting, not only is my work visually has a more Asian or Korean aesthetic, but it's also informed by everything that my ancestors have been through. And I think my grandfather always says to paint with joy. And just like throughout my entire artist career, he's like, "Oh, paint with joy. I see you're frustrated. Paint with joy." And so I think it's also like those like little reminders in the back of my head, where it is like, even if the subject matter isn't necessarily happy or it's a little bit morose, it's always, when I approach work, it's always with joy and love. And it is the love I have for my family that I think is the strongest of all.
I can see that come through. I love the portraits you have of your grandmother and your grandfather, and those always stand out to me because I can feel the joy coming through. I can almost hear your grandfather saying that when I look at the portrait. and those beautiful, stunning colors. It just makes me, I always feel so happy, you know, when I'm seeing that. And I guess similarly, you know, in this thread of your ancestors and family, I know that a lot of your mural work that I've seen and other work that I've seen, even smaller paperworks I've seen you share on your Instagram page, there are a lot of depictions of women. And so I'd love to know, like, who are these women in your work, and what's your relationship to them?
Yeah, I think that it was like without a question to just paint portraits of women. I think that in regards to my work now, it's largely representations of who I am and like the experience I'm going through. Whenever I'm painting, it's usually being pulled from wherever I'm at emotionally, physically at the time. And so whenever I look at a painting that I've done previously, I always remember what I was going through during the work. But I come from a very large family, a very large Korean family, and my grandmother had 7 daughters and no sons. And so it's also like not very traditional as a matriarchy. And you don't necessarily see that with like old Korean families. There's a lot of like value placed on having a son to carry on the name. And without sons, I grew up surrounded by very strong, stubborn Korean women. And I think just being around that since forever um, also made me want to depict women that are just representative of the women that inspired me growing up.
I laugh about the strong, stubborn women thing. It reminds me, I think about my mom. I'm kind of laughing about myself and my mom and so many of my aunties, my aunties I grew up with. But I had a recent conversation with my mom. My brother and I looked at her and were like, why are we so stubborn about things? And we're like, is this a particularly Korean thing? And my mom told me that there is like an idiom, I think that's the right word, called chonggeguri. And it's really like imagining a frog jumping from tadpole to tadpole because you're telling the frog to do something and the frog says, nope, I'm gonna go do something else. I'm gonna go this way instead. Because that's how I've always reacted to things. And my mom, she was kind of like, my brother and I were so mystified by this. We're like, oh, chonggeguri, like this is a new thing we're learning. And my mom's like, yeah, that you're Korean. Why are you so, you know, like amazed by this? But yeah, no, I think that when I see the women in your work, I feel an instant connection with them because, you know, I don't know much about my family, and so I feel like seeing your work is also kind of like seeing family, which I love. And my next question is a bit of a personal one, because in thinking about your work, and I think just our connections with the Korean diaspora, I realize as an adult that much of my Korean identity and how I've expressed my Korean identity, especially as a kid, I kept it very private. Being Korean meant being at home and not really expressing it publicly. I didn't know many other Korean people growing up, very few. But the way when I'm with my family, when we're at my parents' house, like we're very Korean, like our mannerisms, the way we speak, like how we express our emotions, we're much more physical how we talk, even how and what we eat. And I think growing up, I didn't know or feel that being Korean could be a very public expression, since representation in media, in books, museums, and school, what I was learning in school, it was zero. There was nothing. So being Korean as a young person was like having these two lives. One was very private at home, one was outside that was much more ambiguous. So when I first started seeing your murals, which are very public, it was always very emotional. Like I stopped, did a double take, and just spent time looking at your work. And so, my question is like, what is your experience like as you're creating a mural and sharing your identity and sharing your experiences with the public, a very broad public?
Yeah, well, so many things to say. Changdaeguri is a very dear family story that's like been passed down. My aunt is like reads it to her daughters every night, kind of like listen to mother, please. Um, yeah, I think that to be Korean is to like come from a very rich and vibrant culture. And it's not necessarily, I think that especially today in popular media, there's a very kind of like surface level view of what it is to be Korean, and it is to like sing and dance well, which isn't the case for all Koreans, a very minor subset. And so I think that when I paint murals and when I'm like doing work in the public sphere, um, it's something that I really want to celebrate, to highlight, to be like, this isn't necessarily every Korean American or Korean story, but it is mine. And I think that people can resonate with that. And I think that when it does come to street art or murals, there's a responsibility you have as an artist, whether you want to or not, when you are coming to a community that's not your own and putting up work that's going to be there for the foreseeable future. And I think with that responsibility comes with just being very conscious of the subject matter, and to have a level of being an educator, where like I've painted in some like not very diverse places. I painted in like the middle of nowhere, Virginia for like 3 years. And it was like, there were a lot of questions like, why are you painting an Asian woman? Like, what does this mean? Like, why do we need this here? And it was like, for for how frustrating it was at times, it was realizing that it's because people haven't been exposed to this type of like culture. They don't know what it is to be Asian, or to like be influenced by um, this like community. And so um, I think public art is such a good tool to educate people, and I think it's so important for uh, artists of many different backgrounds to find walls and to show representation through that.
Absolutely. And I think, in listening to what you're just sharing and the need for that representation, why representation is so important in so many different places, and reflecting back, in the pandemic, which we're still in, we've seen and witnessed a very difficult, very violent and traumatic rise of anti-Asian hate and violence across the country and around the world. And I think we know, but I've learned that a lot of people don't know that anti-Asian violence is not a new phenomenon. It's not new, and it's not something that started with the pandemic with COVID-19. It's something that's been happening for hundreds of years in this country. It's a very sad and very common occurrence throughout American history. Like, you can go back as far as 1882 with the Chinese Exclusion Act, but you can go back even further. Women from Asia were barred from coming into the country. And before even the United States was the United States, there were people here from Asia, because of global imperialism for a lot of European powers. And so the presence of Asian people in this country goes back for a long, long time, and a lot of really sad, devastating stories facing Asian communities has been, it's a very long part of our American history that we don't learn about. But I don't want to, this is my final question, I don't want to end on a sour note because, on a sad note, because the devastation is still there, the violence is still there. There's so much more that needs to be done to raise awareness and to support Asian American communities. But in thinking about, we're recording this soon after the Gregorian New Year, and we're looking forward to the Lunar New Year on February 1st. Shout out to anyone who's Year of the Tiger. My question for you to end on a hopeful note is, what do you hope for?
Yeah, I mean, yeah, the last few years have been rough, to understate it. And I think that with all the heartbreak and just the grieving that we had to do as a community, I think it not only brought us together, but it also was a period of reflection. And I think during this period of reflection, as a collective, we kind of realized that the treatment that we've withstood for like since Asians came to America is unacceptable. The being boxed in and stereotyped is like is just really unfortunate, and it's our reality, but it doesn't have to be. And so I think that with like the rise of anti-Asian hate crimes and just general discontent. It was really a rallying point. I think for probably like one of the first major rallying points in a long time, where we felt that not only could we speak up and could we kind of like communicate and network through social media and just have like a very large kind of powerful collective, but it was that we had to and that we were forced to do it. And so it really, for the new year, I have a lot of hope. I think that we can continue off of this momentum. I think it's not just speaking out. It is like demanding to be treated differently. It's to demand to be represented in not just art or media, but like in all these fields. And so, yeah, I'm excited. I think there's so much work we have to do. Um, so much work that makes me tired sometimes. But I really think that as a community, we are rising to the occasion, and there really isn't anything we can't do if we all have positive mentalities and work together.
I love that that you're excited and hopeful. I share that with you. The last couple of years have been very, very difficult, but just to share some things that I've been observing in my work with educators and students is that there is a desire to learn more about these histories to contextualize this really difficult time and to find pathways forward. I was talking with someone earlier today, a woman who's 86 years old, Japanese American, has lived through, a lot in her life. We were talking about the power of art, and we were talking about the power of how art can bring people together, and art can tell some of the most difficult stories that we as human beings might have difficulty in talking about just on our own. And so, I'm excited with you because I'm starting to see things happening where it's like, okay, things might be okay. There's still a lot of work to do. I join you with that. There's always going to be a lot of work to do. But as I talk with you and learn more about you and see your work and then look at this logo with everyone here, and seeing these great sort of giants of the Asian American art world from the past and from today and the future looking at you, I think, I'm also very excited and very hopeful as well. Yeah, Julia, thank you so much. It's been so great to be in this conversation with you.
Yeah, thank you so much. I mean, it's wonderful meeting you and being able to talk.
Yeah, yeah, same. This has been such a great evening, and I know that we still have some time. And so for those who are joining our conversation, who have been with us throughout this conversation, you're welcome to leave questions for Julia to learn more about her work. Any questions that you have, please drop them in the chat.
Yeah. I will say that I think that there's like a huge, like, I think as like the generations have gone by, like with Asian Americans, I mean, I know that my grandparents' generation like underwent a lot of suffering. And I think that it's like a very relatable experience for like many different Asian countries that came to the US. And so I think with those experiences and traumas that they carried into the US, it made them less feel like they just wanted to protect their children and wanted them to grow up in a safe community. And so they were less likely to speak out against injustices. And I think that as the generations have gone by, as like we become more Americanized, or strong-willed or like stubborn, I think that especially in my generation, you see a lot of people like just like sending out a tweet and like that being just like a small form of resistance, of empowerment. And so I think it has been really interesting seeing the differences in generations, but ultimately knowing that we're all working together.
Yeah, absolutely. We're all working together. And when I look at everyone who's in your logo, and I've loved that we stayed with this image because I'm actually thinking about these artists differently as we're talking. I'm curious, like a kind of a fun question. I like to ask students this question all the time. It's like, if you were to, have a meal with folks in throughout history, we've all kind of played with this question before. What would you want to talk to them about if you were to kind of sit down and have a meal or tea with these artists in this logo? What would you hope to have a conversation about?
I think that just like in general, I'm a listener. I'm not a big talker. And so if I was able to sit down with all of them, it would really just be like, tell me your life story, tell me everything. And then it would be technical questions about their work. But they really are so impressive. And even Ching Ho Cheng on the far left, he was like in the media kind of like labeled as like the first like successful Asian American artist. Like that's how he's kind of like portrayed. And I thought it was really interesting that there is like a single person that people point to as like having being able to broken through like this I guess the glass ceiling, and that was him. But you don't really hear about him. But he was like crazy backstory, born in Cuba, immigrated to the US, and just like ended up leaving phenomenal work behind as his legacy. So yeah, I think it's just, and the two that are alive are Jennifer Wen Ma and Nikki S, the two women in the painting.
Yeah, so, I love their work.
So cool.
It's so cool.
We had one audience member who wants to know if we can see the slides again.
Sure. Yeah, so this slide is this slide is a painting of a mural I did in Austin, Texas in 2019. It's titled Senja, and it was one of the first murals I painted of a Korean woman in hanbok. And a hanbok is a traditional Korean dress. And I think it was about 30 feet tall and 20 feet wide, and I painted it in 2 days. And then the next slide. The next slide are it's a portraits of my grandmother and grandfather. And this was just some of like the work that I started when I was painting my family, and it was like very resonant. And the series of the work is called I Gave a Lot of Water to My Flower of Laughter. And so it's a freehand pattern that I've refined over the years, but it's to represent just like, I think the sacrifice of like creating the flower garden, a family. And so the next slide. So these were two of my first paintings that I painted in early 2019. And you might recognize the painting on the left was reinterpreted as a mural that was just shown. But they were kind of like my, the first paintings that were very emotionally resonant to me, and what really ultimately made me decide that I wanted to like really continue with this subject matter and body of work. And the next slide. Oh, thank you. The next slide is a mural that I painted in August. It was commissioned by the Korean Cultural Center, and it's outside of Culture House. And it was in, it was a joint show where the Korean Cultural Center had an exhibition inside with, I think, 5 Korean American artists from across the country. And it was, I based it off of my cousin who's 6 years old. And then the cranes are a part of the symbols of longevity, and they're very dear to my family. And so it's kind of like a tribute to my family. And the next slide. So I run the Korean Archives, which is a photo archive project. And so we accept community submissions, and people from all over the world have contributed their family photos and stories. And the 2 photos are on the right are of my family in particular. On the bottom, it's my grandfather's father, sisters, and brother-in-law. And then the photo above it is of my grandparents' wedding. And so the 2 people in the suit and wedding dress are my grandparents. And it's their entire family positioned next to them and behind them. And then the painting on the left was inspired by the photos that my family has. It's of my grandfather's family, his parents, his sisters and brother. And then the words translated are those who don't change will perish, but so will those who do. In the next slide, this is the logo that I painted for the Phillips Collection for their 100th anniversary. And we've talked long about it so far. So yeah.
Do you have any work you're doing now that you can talk about?
Yeah, so I have a solo exhibition in April, and you're invited.
Oh,
Everybody's
hey,
invited.
congratulations.
Thank you. And so for the exhibition, it is going to be titled Time Gently Chimes. And it is a love letter to my family and the immigrant story. But in particular, I have taken traditional Korean jars, so kimchi jars, danji, and I'm painting on them and to create like a little kind of kimchi jar garden. And so,
that's so cool.
Thank you. Yeah, I hope to exhibit it during that show. We'll see if time allows. It's a lot of work.
That's wonderful. Yeah. That's great.
Thank you.
I'm trying to see if we have any questions here thanks for walking through your slides again.
Of course.
You know, we're talking about the artist in this logo. It's been a very interesting time lately in Washington, D.C. for anyone, if you're in the D.C. area, or if not, a lot of these exhibitions are also online exhibitions, but the Smithsonian has the Smithsonian's National Portrait Gallery currently has its very first solo exhibition featuring Asian American women artists. Her name was Hung Lu. Unfortunately, she passed away late last year, but it's a beautiful, beautiful show. She has painted these very large scale portraits of women, Asian women, but also people who have really struggled in life, in kind of showing their humanity in their portraiture. Yeah, Hung Lu, I can put if there's a way I can chat with everybody, I can put a link in there, but there's really great attention now on Asian American artists, not only at the Smithsonian, but I've seen through other museums as well. And if you're interested in Asian American histories and artists and culture from other museums across the country, there are incredible places you can look to. You can look to the Wing Luke Museum of the Asian Pacific American Experience in Seattle, Washington. They have a wonderful, I know we're also in the pandemic, but they have a wonderful website. But if you ever find yourself in Seattle, that's a great place to go to. If you're in Los Angeles, in Little Tokyo, there's a Japanese American National Museum. In New York City, there's a Museum of Chinese in America. Our center, the Asian Pacific American Center at the Smithsonian, we don't have a gallery space yet, but we hope to in the future. But through the art museums here in DC, there are great Asian American artists on display. Noguchi, the Isamu Noguchi Museum in Queens, New York. There are so many wonderful places to go and learn about these incredible people and to see their work. And if you're walking around DC and these other places throughout the country that Julia has murals at, keep a lookout, because when you see it in person, it is a truly wonderful experience.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I see my friend Jessica has put a link to the Wing Luke Museum in the chat. Check them out. Oh, Julie, do you have a website?
I do not.
Okay.
I have an Instagram. It's at kimchi.juice, and it's where I posted my work.
I'm gonna plug your Instagram account in the chat. Make sure I spelled it.
I have a question. Are you working on any murals currently?
No, so mural season is usually from spring to fall, and then we all retire in the winter because it's like way too cold to paint outside. And so I usually paint murals for festivals or when I'm traveling. And so festival season is usually summer, fall. So that's when I am most active with painting outdoors.
What makes you, I guess, graduate from smaller work on canvas to wanting to work at that scale?
Well, so I painted my first mural when I was 17, and it was for a festival called DC Walls, which happens, I think, every May. It's been running for a while. Um, and so I met the director, Kelly Tolles, kind of by happenstance. And he was like, I showed him my work and he said, do you want to paint a mural? And I was like, oh man, I'm gonna have to tell my my school that I'm gonna be out for 2 weeks. But so it was kind of, I was just starting to, I had been exhibiting, I started exhibiting work when I was 15 to 16, but kind of when I was, yeah, when I was 17, it was kind of, murals were just like a huge plunge. And so I kind of came up in that environment where after I finished my first wall, which was 132 feet long and I think 12 feet tall, it was kind of like I caught the bug, but then also like nothing could really like intimidate me since I was like, I painted a huge wall, like bring it on. And so I think in contradiction to like starting in studio work like heavily, it was like I started in murals heavily, and then especially during the pandemic, I was able to take time to really devote myself to studio work.
The possibility of exposure.
Yeah.
Julie, you were in New York City's Chinatown recently to work on a project there, right?
Yeah, I was. Unfortunately, that wall didn't, that kind of fell through, but it was really interesting to just kind of see. I don't think I've ever really spent a lot of time in Chinatown in New York City before, and to just see that like the different culture, and to also know that New York City has one of the highest rate of anti-Asian hate crimes, and to really just kind of enmesh myself there and just see all these like elderly Asian people just going about their day. It was very like kind of like, it was very moving, and also like, oh, like you're also my family too. Like and so yeah, I think that when the wall that we had proposed had been approved, but it was very interesting because of just everybody's differing opinions, especially like generationally differing. And so to just be able to speak to the natives, locals that were there, and to just like receive their feedback was, it was very informative to like just see how different, I think, Asians from different generations and different countries like interpretations of art are. And so it was definitely an interesting experience.
Great. I'm so glad you were there. I know there's been recently since last fall up until I think the time I learned you were up there, there were some mural artists going up there to try and build, paint some really beautiful murals. Jessica Snow did a mural up there not that long ago. So I was so excited to see that you were going up there because like you said, then I think there was one statistic last year that the number of hate crimes in New York and LA combined was up 150% since the start of the pandemic. And so the community can use all of the love we can give it, because like you said, we're all family. It's one big family.
I would like to thank everyone. Thank you, Julia and Andrea, for talking about your logo and your experience as artists and working in the museum industry. We at the Phillips Collection really appreciate the work that you've done for our centennial year. So we'd like to thank everyone for coming out tonight and have a good time.
We should look in GroupMe and it's
Yeah. Thank you so much for having me. It really is an honor to have worked on this project and to just be able to share a little bit about this piece and my story. And it was lovely to meet you and Andrea and everybody involved at the Phillips.
Yeah, thank you all so much. Thanks to the Phillips. Thank you, Julia. Thank you to the Phillips Collection team. It's great honor to do this with you all.
And follow Julia on Instagram.
Okay,
Good night, everyone.
good night.